The hospital in your county was probably built by people who lived there. That is not a sentimental way of putting it. It is usually literally what happened. A lot of rural American hospitals exist because a county passed a bond, or a church raised the money, or a mine operator and a doctor and a bank manager sat in a room in 1954 and decided the nearest surgery being 60 miles away was not acceptable anymore. Then it ran for decades, badly funded and permanently on the edge, and it delivered most of the people now living in that county. And then, somewhere in the last 15 years or so, a lot of those hospitals stopped being owned by anyone in the county. I did a video recently about who has been buying the land in Appalachia. This one is about what happened next because the land was only the first thing bought. The second wave went after something else entirely, and it is the part people notice much later, usually in an emergency. Let me give you the number that started me on this. There are roughly 447 hospitals in the United States owned by private equity firms. And at least a quarter of them, something over 25%, serve rural populations. Now hold that against a fact about rural medicine that is easy to say and hard to feel. In a city, if your hospital is bad, you go to a different hospital. In a county of 11,000 people, there is no different hospital. There is that one, or there is an hour and a half in a car, or there is a helicopter you cannot afford. So the ordinary market logic that is supposed to discipline a bad owner does not exist here. The patients cannot leave, which, from a certain kind of investor's point of view, is not a problem with the asset. It is the reason the asset is attractive. Here is how the model works, and I want to lay it out plainly because it is not complicated and almost nobody explains it. A private equity firm raises a fund. That fund is not patient money. It typically wants its return inside a defined window, often something like 5 to 7 years. That is the clock everything else runs on. The firm buys the hospital, and it usually does so using a large amount of borrowed money. Here is the part that surprises people the first time they hear it. In a leveraged buyout, the debt used to buy the company is generally loaded onto the company itself. The hospital does not receive an investment. The hospital acquires a debt, incurred in order to purchase it. Now the hospital has to service that debt out of operations, which means the operation has to produce more cash than it did before, on the same building, in the same county, with the same number of sick people in it. There are only so many ways to do that. You can cut staff, and staffing is the single largest cost in a hospital. You can bill harder, you can outsource the emergency department to a staffing company, or you can close the units that lose money. And I want to stop on that last one because there is one unit that goes first almost every time, and what has happened to it across rural America in the last 15 years is genuinely difficult to believe. Labor and delivery. A maternity unit is expensive to run and impossible to run part-time. You need obstetric staff and anesthesia available around the clock, whether 2 babies arrive that month or 20, because you cannot schedule when a woman goes into labor. In a rural county, the volume is low, the payer mix is heavily Medicaid, and Medicaid reimbursement for deliveries frequently comes in below what the delivery costs. So on a spreadsheet, the maternity ward is the obvious cut. And it has been cut over and over across the entire country. Since 2010, more than 500 American hospitals have stopped delivering babies. Between 2010 and 2022, 238 rural hospitals and 299 urban hospitals lost obstetric services. In the same period, only around 138 hospitals added them, and most of those were in cities. Here is what that has done to the map. By 2022, more than half of all rural hospitals in the United States, about 52%, no longer offered obstetric care at all. In 2010, that figure was 43%. In 12 states, a quarter or more of rural hospitals lost the service in that window, and in Pennsylvania and South Carolina, it reached 46%. And there are now 8 states where more than 2/3 of rural hospitals do not deliver babies. One of them is West Virginia. Roughly 35% of American counties are classified as maternal health deserts. Think about what that means in practice on a specific road in February. A woman in labor in a rural county now routinely faces a drive of an hour or more. Not to a preferred hospital, to any hospital that will take her. On mountain roads, at night, in weather, possibly in a private car because the county has one ambulance and it is on another call. That is not a market efficiency. That is a category of risk that did not exist in that county in 2009 and does now. Not every one of those closures was caused by a private equity buyout, and I am not going to claim it was. The economics were punishing before anybody bought anything. But when a buyer arrives who needs the building to throw off more cash than it currently does, the maternity ward is the first line item they find. And there is now a decade and a half of national data showing exactly where that road ends. Or, and this is the one that turns a bad situation into a permanent one, you can sell the real estate. There is a maneuver here worth understanding because it explains a lot of otherwise inexplicable closures. The buyer separates the hospital's operations from the land and buildings underneath it. The property gets sold to a real estate company, sometimes a related one, which produces a large amount of cash immediately. The hospital then rents its own building back forever at a rent it did not previously have to pay. The cash goes out, the rent stays. And a hospital that owned its own premises, which is the one thing that made its thin margins survivable, is now a tenant. When that hospital closes 4 years later, the local paper will report that it could not make the economics work. That is true. It is just not the whole sentence. Now, I want to be fair here, and I'm going to be, because this subject attracts a lot of people who are not. Some rural hospitals were failing before anybody bought them. Rural America has been losing population for decades. The payer mix in these counties is heavily Medicare and Medicaid, and reimbursement rates genuinely do not cover the cost of running a small facility with an emergency room open at 3 in the morning. Some private acquisitions have kept doors open that would otherwise have closed. That is real, and anyone who tells you every one of these deals is a straightforward robbery is selling you something, but it does not resolve the problem because the question is not whether these hospitals were struggling. They were. The question is what the ownership change did to the odds and whether the money extracted on the way through was money the building needed to survive. And then there is the billing. Even where the hospital stays open, the emergency department may no longer be staffed by the hospital. It may be contracted to a physician staffing firm. Envision Healthcare, owned by the private equity giant KKR, has been one of the largest of these with a significant rural footprint. Companies in that business became central to what got called surprise billing. You go to a hospital that is in your insurance network. You are seen by a doctor who, it turns out, is not because the doctor works for the contractor rather than the hospital. You did not choose that doctor. In an emergency, you were in no condition to ask. And weeks later, a bill arrives for thousands of dollars from an entity you have never heard of. When Congress moved to restrict that practice, the industry fought it. Envision alone spent something on the order of $57 million on lobbying in 2020. $57 million in 1 year from one company to preserve the ability to send that bill. Now let me move to the second thing that got bought, because if the hospital is the emergency, this is the everyday. Around 20 million Americans live in manufactured housing, trailers, mobile homes, whatever your county calls them. In much of rural Appalachia and the rural South, it is a large share of the affordable housing that exists. And there is a structural trap built into it that most people who do not live in one have never thought about. You own the home. You do not own the ground it sits on. You rent that from whoever owns the park. The word mobile is doing a lot of dishonest work in that arrangement. Moving a manufactured home is not a matter of hitching it up. It costs thousands of dollars, requires specialist equipment, frequently damages the structure, and needs somewhere to go, which in a rural county with 2 parks, and both of them full, means there is nowhere. So the resident owns an asset they cannot move, sitting on land somebody else controls, and the land can be sold without them. Investors worked out some time ago that this is close to a perfect position from which to raise rent. The tenant cannot leave. Their home is the collateral for their own captivity. What follows an acquisition has been documented repeatedly. The lot rent goes up, sometimes sharply, sometimes repeatedly. Maintenance slows or stops. Residents report water shutoffs, poor quality drinking water, plumbing failures, floors giving way, and abandoned units left rotting in place because nobody cleared them out. And the population this lands on is specific. These parks are disproportionately home to people who are older, disabled, on fixed incomes, or otherwise least able to absorb a rent increase or organize a legal fight. So put the whole picture together, because the individual pieces are reported separately and almost never assembled. The farmland gets bought by an entity registered in another state. The forest gets bought by a fund that makes its money on carbon credits. The water gets committed to a data center. The hospital gets bought, mortgaged with the debt used to buy it, stripped of its real estate, and rented back to itself. The emergency room gets contracted out to a company that bills you separately. And the cheapest housing in the county gets bought by someone who understands that the people in it cannot leave. Every one of those is a rational decision by somebody with a fiduciary duty to somebody else. None of those people are villains in the cartoon sense. That is exactly why it does not stop. And when the county ends up with no maternity ward, no landlord you can find, an ambulance ride that costs more than a month's income, and land owned by an LLC with a registered agent in Delaware, the explanation offered is that the area is in decline. It is not in decline. It is being processed. And there is a second collapse happening underneath the first one that almost nobody counts, because it does not have a building attached to it. When a rural hospital closes, the ambulance service does not automatically expand to cover the longer drive. In much of rural Appalachia, emergency medical service is provided by volunteers or by a squad funded on a shoestring by the county or by a private company operating on thin margins. Stretch the distance to the nearest open emergency room from 12 miles to 55 miles, and you have not just added 40 minutes to the patient's journey. You have taken that ambulance and its crew out of the county for the better part of 2 hours, during which time it is not available for anybody else. So the second call waits. And in a county with 1 or 2 units, the second call is not rare. This is the part of the story that never appears in the closure announcement, because it happens to different people on different days, and it never gets attributed to the closure at all. The hospital shutting is an event with a date on it. What follows is a slow, distributed, unrecorded increase in the time it takes to reach anybody having the worst day of their life. There is no press release for that. So here's what I want you to do, and this one is genuinely easy. Find out who owns your county's hospital right now. Not what it is called. The sign on the building is often the last thing to change. Look for the parent company, and then look for who owns the parent company, and keep going until you hit either a family, a nonprofit board, a religious order, a public authority, or an investment fund. That last one is the one worth knowing about before the day you need the building. Tell me what you find. County and what you turned up in the comments. I will read every one of them, and if enough of you do it, we will have something that does not currently exist in public anywhere.